Catholic sisters are the ones who run our hospitals in many ways, and they were indispensable to the Affordable Care Act passing. So what this shows, again, I'll just keep emphasizing this again and again, is usually the people who are most powerful are not the ones who change things. And very specifically, I'll mention just today, before I came here, this cross, there's a fast starting today on the Mall on immigration reform. It's immigrants, undocumented people, who are beginning a fast. There's tents up. It's called Families Fast. And we had a press conference and an opening service, and I'm fasting with them. So I had to teach my class, but I'm wearing the cross, which I put the cross around everyone's neck who was fasting, and then I put one around my own at the end. They're ordinary people who are fasting. And so here's all the press there, and, they asked the question, but isn't there really no hope of this? I mean, we got 15 days left in Congress. You've probably read the stories. 15 days, not much time left. Isn't this going to fail? And I said, what are we doing here? Fasting? Praying? This is Washington, D.C. Politics and power. Here we are, fasting and praying. I said, don't regard this as a symbol or a tactic. We have won the battle for immigration reform in this country. All around this country, we have overwhelming support for immigration reform across boundaries, parties, races, all over the country. We've done everything you should have to do to win something in a democracy. 70% of the American people are for this. It's being blocked by a minority of lawmakers who are stopping it, blocking it. And sometimes, after you've organized and battled and marched and done everything you can, sometimes you turn to prayer and fasting to take it to a deeper level. And I said in particular, we are praying and fasting against the political dysfunction that rules this city and could destroy immigration reform, the political self-interest that's put ahead of those families and children. And I was the only person up there that wasn't a person of color. So I said, it's my job to say this. We're fasting against the use of racism to block and deny immigration reform, the use of racial slurs, racial fears. Stephen King, congressman from Iowa, is a racist. And that fear of brown people, 11 million brown people, becoming part of us is behind what's blocking this. And so, very consistent with what the sisters were saying today, finally you got to rise up above the people of power, and the people who aren't the people of power are generally the ones who end up changing things. It's not just influencing them and lobbying them and saying, please, please, please. We're really fasting and praying against that dysfunction now. My hope is this prayer and fasting will grow around the country. A number of leaders were there, Franciscans and Catholic sisters, and Simone Campbell from Network was there, and a lot of folks were there speaking after we launched this. And I think it could grow around the country. And I want the people who are blocking this to see people of faith fasting and praying. So you can learn more about it on our website, but it just happened this morning. And that's why I don't normally wear this cross, but I'm wearing it today and fasting with my friends over there. So here we are, turning to, since we solved immigration and race and climate and poverty, we thought we'd now turn to war and peace. This topic, let me just say, this topic is always very hard. this topic is always very hard. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., this was the most unpopular thing he ever did, to come out against the war in Vietnam. It was the hardest thing, the most unpopular thing he ever did. I think it was the right thing, but most of his staff, his internal staff in SCLC, was against him coming out against the war in Vietnam. Most of the civil rights movement was against him coming out against the war in Vietnam. But the connections between race, poverty, and war were too great for him to ignore. He talked about the three triplets: racism, poverty, and militarism, as three triplets who were deeply intertwined, these triplets. The movement was afraid that him coming out against the war would turn President Lyndon Johnson against the civil rights movement, that we'd lose our progress in civil rights if Johnson got mad, the civil rights movement came out against the war in Vietnam. It might distract Congress from their goals. They're afraid of the anger it could produce across the country. It's always hard to oppose a war after it starts. Very difficult, because it's a hard topic when it's personal, when there are people who are already fighting the war. There are people's sons and daughters and brothers and sisters and dads and moms who are already in harm's way, who've already been hurt or injured for the rest of their lives, or already even have been killed. And so when you raise questions about the war, it really gets very personal, because it is very personal. If you question the reasons why, it's very difficult to hear. So you've seen the ads, the moving ads that always strike me, the wounded warrior ads on television, donations for our, and they show these men and women who have suffered so much and are just resilient, who are playing basketball in wheelchairs and who are running marathons with artificial legs and helping each other, and then you see the sacrifices they've made, and your heart goes out, and you so admire their courage and their sacrifice. But you can never ask, why were they injured? Why were they hurt? Where were they? What were they doing? And was this really necessary? Was this really necessary? Why this terrible tragedy had to occur? And isn't this, if it wasn't right, if it wasn't necessary, if it was based on distortions and even lies, wasn't this a horrible waste of lives, of limbs, of families? But you raise that question, and let me guarantee you're in a lot of trouble. Those are hard questions. I would imagine in your own families and friendship circles, there are people who have been touched deeply by these wars of occupation in Iraq and Afghanistan. So this isn't just a political issue, it's a personal issue. Brother, sister, cousin, father, mother, friend of the family. And when the nation has been rallied to fight the war, justifications, all of the things that Dick Cheney lived for, how to distort intelligence and prove that this is a winnable war, whether they're factual or not, and they're often not factual. Dick Cheney's justifications were not factual for the war in Iraq. But they justified the war, and they appealed to patriotism and nationalism, deep emotions, deep feelings that people have about their country, very powerful forces. So here are some points for our discussion today. What we're going to do is, because of our wonderful time with our friends, I'm going to do a lecture, and then we'll take a break, and we'll come back, and we'll do the reflection time and Q&A time all together at the same time. It'll work fine, but it was worth having our friends to start our conversation. Number one, war is always a sign of failure. Say it again. War is always a sign of failure. Failure to deal with or solve the problem that was the cause of the conflict. We didn't solve it. We didn't deal with it. We didn't fix it. We didn't find a way to resolve this, so we went to war. War always means a failure to resolve a problem in any other way. So really, war is a result of failure. War is never a win. No matter who wins, there's loss on every side. War is always a sign of failure. 2, nonviolence, alternatives to war, have to answer the questions that war was trying to answer, but in a better way. Nonviolence can't just be, well, we're against war. We don't want war. We don't do war. Well, nonviolence, if it's an effective alternative, if it's any kind of a better answer, has to answer the questions war purports to answer, but in a different and a better way. That's a real challenge for people who are against war. Not to just be against war. It's what I call the difference between what Jesus calls for. Jesus didn't call us to be peace lovers. That's not the language. Jesus called his disciples to be peacemakers. That's a very different thing. A lot of anti-war people are peace lovers. They don't like war or against it. They won't fight, but they're not going to be engaged in peacemaking, which is how do you solve the problems that war is allegedly solving. Nonviolence doesn't get off easy because of war's failures. It doesn't get to avoid the tough questions like, how do you deal with real evil in the world? How do you deal with real evil in the world? Deal with violence in the world. Number 3, both war and its alternatives, let's say hard power and soft power, military solutions, diplomatic solutions, development solutions, have to be judged by their results. That's a fair question. Is it working? For example, in 2 wars of occupation in Iraq and Afghanistan, since 9/11, let's be very specific. This is a fair question. Have we killed more terrorists than we have recruited? It's a fair question. Have we killed more terrorists who were a danger, real danger, than we have recruited? Are there more or less terrorists now? Are my children who live in Washington, D.C., are they safer now because of Iraq and Afghanistan, or are they in more danger? That's a fair question. So often people who support the war solution say, well, nonviolence doesn't work. Okay, that's a fair question. Is what you're doing working? Does your war policy work in resolving the things you said it was supposed to resolve? Both have to be evaluated by their metrics, not just by philosophical discussion. Fair question. And fourth, and I can say this more safely at Georgetown than I used to at Harvard, for people of faith, issues of war and peace must be ultimately answered theologically and not just politically. For people who claim they're people of faith, it means the answers to this have to finally be rooted in our tradition, our theology, our what we confess as faith, not just our political differences. Can we fight this war? Can we fight any war? Is this a just war or not? Now, in the Christian tradition, it's very similar to other faith traditions. There really are not many alternatives. One we call pacifism. No war, no violence, pacifism. We reject the idea of war. That's how the early church, the first Christians, lived for the first 3 centuries of the church's life. There was no Christians involved in the Roman army. Part of being a Christian was you did not serve in the army. That was for 3 centuries until Constantine. So it's old, and first was the original tradition. The Aquinas, Augustine, I would say some motivated by Constantine, developed the second idea, the just war. That is newer. That wasn't the original tradition, just war. Okay, a little quiz for all you smart Catholic kids. Give me the criteria for the just war. Let's name them together. What are they? A war has to be, what are the criteria? Just shout them out. What's that? Last resort? It must be, which means you've got to have tried everything else first before you use war, right? Fair? What else? Defensive. Yeah, defensive, sure. It has to be in defense of, not reactive. Offensive. Yeah, right? Okay, what else? Proportionality. Okay, which means you can't use more force to solve something if what you're creating is causing more violence. The proportion of what you do has to finally be less than the violence that it causes. Yep.
There has to be a reasonable chance that you'll succeed.
That's right. Reasonable chance you will succeed. In other words, if this isn't going to work or make it worse, if there's a real problem, but this won't make it better or make it worse, you can't do it. To others, just cause, right? Just cause. There must be a just cause for doing this. Now, there's just intention. Am I really trying to defend here, or am I really trying to take over Mexico? Because we like the idea of Mexico being part of us. What's the cause? What's the purpose here? So those are some of the criteria, which you've heard, right, in your classes and your churches and so on. Just war. What's interesting is how when a war starts, generally, or they're leading up to it, the just war doctrine is usually employed by the people who want to start the war to justify the war they're about to start. It generally isn't so much clergy who say, okay, let's look at this Iraq war. Okay? Just cause. Saddam Hussein. Horrible, horrible, brutal dictator. Oppressing his people. Might have weapons of mass destruction. All of those are legitimate concerns. But was it last resort? Really? Last resort? It was UN inspectors were saying we are succeeding. In fact, the inspectors were proven right in the end. They were succeeding. There were no weapons of mass destruction. Give us some time. No, we have to go now. It was not last resort. Proportionality, it'll be easy. Cheney said, we'll be seen as liberators, welcomed in. Did that happen? Well, not quite the way planned. So how do you evaluate wars? So Thomas Merton said the root of war, what did he say, is what? Fear. The root of war, Thomas Merton, the great Trappist monk, said the root of war is fear. So I gave you some things to read about all this. I'm not going to repeat them all, but I want to do a couple paragraphs from this section called Nonviolent Realism. Nonviolent realism. When it comes to the problem of evil, we have been torn between two inadequate alternatives. One which we will call liberal pacifism, which often underestimates the realities of evil in our world, suggesting that the problems of violence merely derive from misunderstanding or miscommunication. We just haven't heard the other side, right? It's It's sort of, we just need to hear each other better, listen better. And that's really all it is. Although those problems surely exist, they do not explain all the conflicts in our world today, some of which come from genuine threats and deliberate and determined evil, I would say. One of the worst forms of this option is ascribing evil only to the United States, which people on the left sometimes do, and everything else comes from that. The superpower is at stake, the Soviets or the U.S. or whatever. The other response, which I call conservative combat, often makes two fundamental mistakes. While recognizing the reality of evil, conservative combatants ascribe it only to our adversaries. They are evil and we are good, and aren't able to engage in critical self-reflection about the evil that lies also within us, our country, our side, which is a fundamental theological and spiritual mistake. In fact, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote Gulag Archipelago, I love this quote from him. Gradually, he was in a Russian prison camp when he came up with this for years. Gradually, it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart, and then all human hearts. The line shifts. Inside us, it oscillates with the years, and even within hearts overwhelmed by evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained, and even in the best of all hearts, there remains an uprooted small corner of evil. That changes the whole notion of us and them, good, evil, right, and wrong. The other miscalculation the conservative combatants make is in believing that evil can be destroyed only by military power. Once you've determined there's evil, the only thing that can destroy it is military power. Often, though, the narrow military strategy of directly and aggressively combating evil can inadvertently result in its further spread or escalation, often sparking a downward spiral of violence and counterviolence, violence and counterviolence, and leading to a legion of unintended consequences. Evil is not easily or quickly smashed, as some like to suggest. Rather, it must be sometimes simply constrained, contained, surrounded, diffused, and undermined from within rather than from without, and patiently resisted and uprooted until the evil is finally, eventually, overcome. I call that option nonviolent realism. Evil is real. How do you, not whether to confront it, but how do you confront it? The causes of violence. We attack the symptoms or the results. We often don't look at the causes of terrorism. What is the reality of corrupt oil regimes like Saudi Arabia, from which most of the 9/11 terrorists came, the Gulf states? Next week, I'm going to be in Abu Dhabi. David Courtwright is coming to lecture here. It's the World Economic Forum. I've been there before. Dubai and Abu Dhabi are, I would call, they feel to me like slave societies. A small number of people control the entire society. If you're an employee, your employer has your passport, keeps your passport. You can't move, you can't change. You're totally under the control of your employer. It is a society that breeds discontent, anger, and sometimes terrorism. Is that justified? No. My view is to take innocent lives, which was what terrorism is never justified, no matter what. And there are people who suffer grievances who don't respond in that way, but the grievances are real. How do we understand them and deal with the grievances that spawn and spark terrorism rather than just attack the terrorism? And then reactionary Islamic fundamentalism, for example, you heard today, our friends here are being attacked by fundamentalism in Indonesia. They're talking about an Islam that is peaceable and open and dialogical, and they're being attacked by Islamic fundamentalism. There's fundamentalism in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So often the response to grievances is religious fundamentalism. That doesn't mean the 9/11 victims deserve what they got. Doesn't mean that at all. But it is to suffer a cowardly criminal attack as they did is utterly immoral. But how do you change the causes behind that and not just the symptoms? Generally, warfare is about the causes, but the symptoms and not the causes. How do we talk about causes? I love Mother Teresa's line, if we have no peace, it's because we have forgotten that we belong to each other. A number of you mentioned this in your reflections. We've in this class been learning how, whether it be poverty or immigration or race or even understanding climate change based on those who suffer from it, it's our relationship with people who we haven't been in relationship before that often changes our hearts and minds and thinking. You heard our brother say, what's the role of faith? If someone is my enemy, he said, it may be I don't know them. Now, it doesn't mean there's nothing, that they're no threat to you. They may be, but you often don't know your enemy. And so enemy becomes the other, and governments use the other, fear of the other, to justify war and military action. If your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink. For by doing this, you'll heap burning coals on their heads. Don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Romans 12:20-21. But I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. How many of you have heard a lot of sermons on those scriptures since 9/11? Not many churches have had sermons on, blessed are the peacemakers, for they'll be called the children of God. We haven't heard many sermons on those passages. And yet the nation now is suffering what many call a war exhaustion. The teaching of Jesus here is not that you won't have enemies. He's not saying you won't have enemies. He talks about how to deal with them. Now, if you looked at some of the readings, we won't go into in depth, but Walter Wink, theologian scholar, talked about how some of Jesus' teachings about, in response to the Romans, were not a passive kind of thing, but really were almost a nonviolent strategy. You're not just your coat, but your cloak and so on, go the extra mile, all that. If you look at the context, those were almost tactics for nonviolent resistance, not just loving your enemies does not mean to submit to their domination. That's not what the text means. It means to respond in a different kind of way. Here's the linchpin for me. Human conflict is inevitable. Conflict between us human beings is inevitable for all kinds of reasons, between nations, between classes, between race. Conflict becomes inevitable. Conflict resolution, which is a growing sense of vocation for many young people today, conflict resolution, the arts and sciences of conflict resolution. How do you resolve? What do we have learned about that? Conflict resolution is a way to resolve inevitable human conflicts, and most of our conflicts are resolved without violence. Every day on this campus, there's conflict. between all kinds of folks in the city, in this world. Most of our human conflicts are resolved without resort to violence. So how do we increase the number of conflicts that can be resolved without violence? That's what conflict resolution is. I remember I was at a seminary once years ago, and I was in a debate about pacifism and just war. And it was Fuller Seminary in California, and they had two pulpits. And I was in the pacifist pulpit, and then there was a just war pulpit. And we're sitting there high above this large audience, and it struck me that's the problem. Here we are, sitting high above the real world, having a philosophical debate about pacifism versus just war. It struck me in that moment, we need to get out of the pulpits, down into the streets where the violence is occurring, and figure out how to resolve this. How to resolve this. David Courtwright, who will be lecturing to you next week, he calls himself a pragmatic pacifist. He wants to use methods and strategies like sanctions and all kinds of things that he's expert on, how to reduce and resolve and contain and eventually overcome conflict without the appeal to war. But he doesn't take conflict, he takes conflict seriously in doing so. He'll be very specific on what he thinks can be done to resolve conflict. Paul's words here in Romans, I think that notion of heaping burning coals of shame on the heads of your enemies it means to surprise them, to surprise your enemies with your response. Now, relief and development organizations I know in Afghanistan, when the president was trying to decide whether to have a troop surge, it's one of the things I opposed the president about because I thought it was a mistake. And all the development organizations in Afghanistan, all of them, were in favor instead. They were against the troop surge. All of them were. World Vision, Catholic Charities, all of them were. They were for what I'd call a development surge. What if you were to fill Afghanistan with the things that people needed most, to caricature dropping food and not dropping bombs in key areas, which is a lot cheaper, actually, than dropping bombs, and you turn people toward you instead of against you. But that approach didn't work. Paul's approach is not some naive pacifism, but a shrewd way to change a situation, turn the tables, change the outcome of conflicts. That's what I think that text really means. This whole notion we talked about in our discussion about race and religion and Islam and our response to it, everything really did change on September 11th, like we talked about. Things changed there in our whole conversation about violence and war and peace. How do we change the story? And I told you the story about Heartsong Church and how people can change the story by putting up billboards, love your Muslim neighbor, love your Sikh neighbor. We can change the story that's given to us from our society. And those changing the story things are really like the story I told you about Pakistan, the men who called the church and said, we're going to take care of that little church the rest of our lives. What works best in Pakistan? Drones that you read about in your readings? Or changing that story in a place like Pakistan? What works better? I'm talking about, again, metrics, results. What works, not just what is philosophically preferable to us. There was a young man who showed up at the Sojourners office many years ago, and he said to whoever was at the front desk, he said, I'm here to see Jim Wallis. Is he here? And my staff said, well, yeah, he's here, but he hadn't been here for a month, and he's got meetings all day, and you have an appointment, and you can't just walk in. And this young man was not deterred easily. And he found out where I lived. He tracked me down. And when I came home from work that night, 9 o'clock, he's sitting on my steps. He says, my name is Ibu Patel, and I came across the country to see you. Could I have 10 minutes? And he got 10 minutes and many minutes since then. And Ibu Patel runs the Interfaith Youth Corps out of Chicago now. They're on campuses all over the country, and they are talking about interfaith conversation. Here's what he says. If religious extremism is a movement of young people acting, listen again, if religious extremism is a movement of young people acting, and interfaith cooperation is a movement of senior theologians talking, then we lose. Interfaith dialogue is often senior theologians talking at places like Georgetown. And they can be in this room, and I've been here, and they can have wonderful talks about interfaith collaboration. But if young people are out in the streets, motivated by anger and hostility, he says we lose the conversation. So he's changed the conversation. So young people are talking now on campuses across the country about interfaith collaboration, and Ibu has made a whole powerful organization about this. He says, we are creating a new category in American and global life, which is a category of interfaith cooperation led by young people. Right now, people need to see a young, progressive Muslim. And that changes perceptions. So, finally, how to overcome religious extremism, which is, in fact, behind much of the violence today. First, three things. First, religious extremism will not be defeated primarily by a military response to it. Not be defeated by primarily a military response. Second, religious extremism is best undermined from the inside rather than smashed from the outside. It will be other Christian voices, other evangelical Christian voices that will overcome evangelical fundamentalism. It'll be other Muslim voices that overcome Muslim terrorism. It'll be voices from within, not without, that will change those traditions. Finally, while the use of force to protect security and bring perpetrators to justice is justifiable, defeating the mindset and motives of terrorism will come with much broader and more creative strategies. So very few of us would argue that when there's a situation of violence and threat, that security is needed to protect innocent lives and our kids and all the rest. But if we don't deal with the mindset and motivations behind it, we'll never overcome that violence. So I was struck in your reflections how many of you love the story of Walt Jones, the Congressman. Congressman Walt Jones was a lecturer in this class 2 years ago on this topic of war and peace. And he took off work early, went one day from the House of Representatives and came over, and we had a terrific time with him. I met him at a press conference about the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he didn't talk politics. He talked about his story, just a little bit about it. And I just was so moved by it that I said, hey, we should talk sometime. And he called me the next day and said, how about today? So I went over there. We began this conversation we've had now 10 times over there. He's writing a book now about his story, which I'm helping him get together. It's an amazing story. So he says, I voted for the war in Iraq. I did not feel good about my vote. God was being challenged in my heart by my evil desire to get reelected. Yeah, this guy talks in a way Congress people never talk on Capitol Hill. So he didn't trust the intelligence he was getting about Iraq. But he lived in a district that was 70,000 military veterans, Camp Lejeune. He was sure that if he voted against the war in Iraq, he'd lose re-election. So like many politicians, he chose what would win him re-election. Then he went to a funeral of one of his constituents, Marine Sergeant Michael E. Bitts. This name has changed his life. When you walk into his office, the whole outside of his office The whole wall is covered with pictures of veterans who died. The wall is just covered by photographs of dead soldiers. He met Michael Bitt's wife, Janina, and he was sitting next to them, as the congressman often does. And what really struck him was there's a little boy who was Michael Bitt's son sitting next to his mom. And he was trying to figure out what was going on, and he had a little toy in his lap, and he drops the little toy on the ground. And this is a little tiny thing, but a naval officer saw that, came over, picked up his toy, and gave it back to little Michael's son. And Congressman Jones looked at Michael and said, he doesn't have a dad anymore, who would pick up his toy and put it back in his lap. And the officer had to do it. He doesn't have his dad anymore because I voted for that war. And Michael Bitts is dead. And his son didn't have his dad because I voted for a war I knew was wrong. Unlike most of them, he says that was a sin. Using this Catholic language, he says that was, for me, a sin. So they told me about all the letters he'd written. He's written letters now to every fallen service man or woman and their family members, not just in his district, but across the country. He writes letters to all of them when they're killed from him, apologizing for what's happened. He's written 10,000 letters, which he calls his penance. His penance. And you remember he said in this interview, if half the American people could visit Walter Reed Army Medical Center, we would have been out of Afghanistan 5 years ago. And he's right. He goes there all the time, not just for his constituents, but for anybody who's there. He loves veterans. He has a heart for veterans. And he's not a pacifist. He thinks this war was wrong. He voted for it. And all these people suffered because he didn't have the courage to obey his conscience. And so up there on the hill, they never admit they're wrong, even when they know they're wrong. He admits he was wrong. And he says, and no one's ever said that this whole war was wrong. It was criminal, he says, to fight a war based on information that we know was wrong. And he said it's wrong. As a Catholic, it's a sin, and I'm going to do my penance. His book's going to be a powerful story. I had a similar experience with my own father, and I'll close with this. My dad is now passed. If you've been to the World War II memorial, I took my dad there. He was in his 80s. And it was when it just came up. It just was built. He wanted to go. And I noticed there was all these benches everywhere. There's benches all around. I thought, and my dad went for a bench. And I realized this was built for all the old soldiers who were still alive and would need benches to sit on. They couldn't just stand around looking at all this stuff. They would need a lot of benches. So we sat on that bench, me and my dad, and just talked, I think, for 3 hours. I learned, when you talk to your parents, you often don't even hear all the stuff that was so formative. For 3 hours, he graduated from college, got commissioned in the Naval ROTC, and got married all on the same day. Because in those days, they were rushing them off to the Pacific, right? So he told me about his early dating with my mom and the early years of marriage and on the Pacific and his ship. And I learned more about he and my mom and all that in those 3 hours on that bench than I ever had known before. He just somehow in that environment just started talking. Then he said he was on a destroyer. Destroyers had to get all the mines in the harbors before they invaded an island, Iwo Jima or wherever. So they had a very high lethal rate of destruction. The destroyer is very high. And so he knew he had to go into Tokyo Harbor and get rid of the mines, and so he didn't know if he'd make it. So when they bombed Hiroshima, my dad said, that's great. because he'd had his friends die on Normandy Beach. And he told me, he said, I was glad the Japs got what they deserved in Hiroshima. They got what they deserved. The Japs got what they deserved. That's how we all felt, he said. But one day, a ship came to his destroyer with a researcher on board who was going to go into Hiroshima to see the impact of the nuclear bomb on factories. We didn't know what these bombs did, really. He's going to go and see. And the destroyer's job was to take him to Hiroshima, my dad's ship, and take him onto the island. So this researcher says, does anybody want to go with me? And my dad, the chief engineering officer at 22 or 3, said, sure, I'll go. So here's this guy and my dad, little boat going. This is like just weeks after the bombing of Hiroshima. So my dad gets off. He told me this for the first time sitting on the bench. We got off the boat. We walked on the island, and I had never, ever seen destruction, anything like this. I'd never seen anything like this or even heard of it. There were no factories left, just piles of rubble and dirt. Nothing was left on this island. Almost entirely civilians, Hiroshima. It was not a military target. It was civilians. All dead. 70,000 people were killed. And he walks around, he and this guy, these two 22-year-old guys, a little bit of a shelter thing, and out comes this little, he said, 5-year-old girl. Clothes, tatters on her body, and she's all by herself. There's no one else there. She's totally alone, and she's going to die. Little 5-year-old kid. And my dad, like 60 years later, begins to cry on the bench. And he says, she had nothing to do with this. She had nothing to do with this. And we killed her. And he said, and that's why I've hated war ever since. It's when it gets personal. It's when you know your enemy's children. When you see the, what they call collateral damage of war, that you raise the hard questions. The hard questions that nobody really wants to raise. But as in the faith community, we are obliged to raise them theologically and spiritually, and this country needs people to raise those questions.